The opulent ballroom of the New York Charity Gala buzzed with anticipation. The evening was meant to be a sophisticated gathering dedicated to goodwill, attended by high-profile figures from society. Under the dazzling chandeliers, philanthropists and media elites mingled, sipping champagne and discussing the latest news. Melania Trump, adorned in an exquisite midnight blue gown, was the guest of honor. Despite the constant political controversies surrounding her husband, she had maintained her poise, choosing to focus on charitable causes and steer clear of the chaos. Tonight was no exception, as she stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech on children's education and humanitarian efforts. The crowd fell silent. She spoke with quiet assurance, her Slovenian accent lending a refined touch to her words. But just as she was concluding, a voice suddenly cut through the air like a blade. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" The tone was biting, laced with mockery. A tall, impeccably dressed journalist, widely recognized for his outspoken liberal views, stood near the front, his microphone poised like a weapon. His name was David Calloway, a political correspondent notorious for his sharp critiques of conservatives under the pretense of journalistic objectivity. A hushed stillness swept through the room. Attendees shifted in their seats, exchanging glances of recognition. This was not going to be a routine Q&A. Melania's lips parted slightly, but before she could reply, Calloway pressed on. "Your husband has been accused of dividing the nation, of inciting hatred," he continued, his voice growing more assertive now that all eyes were on him. "And yet you stand here, portraying yourself as a role model. Don't you think the true role models are the ones resisting him?" The weight of his words filled the space, thick with tension. A few journalists smirked, sensing the makings of a viral moment. But before Melania could respond, another voice broke through the silence, strong, resolute. "That's enough." Every head in the room turned as Barron Trump stepped forward from the audience. He was no longer the reserved boy the world had once known from his time in the White House. Now 17, tall, and carrying himself with the poise of someone accustomed to public scrutiny, he was no longer just the son of a former president. He was his own person, and at this moment, he wasn't going to let anyone disrespect his mother. With squared shoulders and a clenched jaw, Barron strode past the tables. Without hesitation, he stepped onto the stage, positioning himself directly between his mother and the reporter. His mere presence was enough to alter the energy in the room. "Excuse me?" Calloway arched an eyebrow, surprised but remaining composed. Barron didn't waver. "You can ask tough questions," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "But this isn't journalism. This is harassment." A murmur spread through the crowd. Caught off guard, Calloway let out a short, breathy laugh, attempting to dismiss the moment. "Oh, and I suppose the president's son is about to give me a lecture on media ethics?" Barron tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto Calloway's with unshaken focus. "No," he responded smoothly. "I'm going to show you what respect looks like." The tension in the ballroom escalated from a subtle undercurrent to an overwhelming force. All attention was fixed on Barron. No one had anticipated him stepping in, certainly not like this, with such composed determination. David Calloway, the outspoken liberal journalist who had initiated the confrontation, was still processing what had just happened. He had expected nervousness, hesitation, perhaps a moment of uncertainty he could turn into a viral soundbite. What he hadn't expected was Barron Trump standing his ground. The smirk on Calloway's face faltered for just a second before he quickly regained his composure. He chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. "Respect?" he repeated, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family are in any position to lecture the press on respect." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the audience, uncertain and uneasy. Some remained motionless, watching as this unexpected confrontation unfolded. Barron stood firm, his shoulders squared. When he spoke, his tone was steady yet unwavering. "You can ask whatever questions you want," he said. But what you just did? That wasn't a question. You tried to embarrass my mother. Calloway's smirk wavered slightly, though he didn't back down. Mrs. Trump is a public figure, he replied. She should expect tough questions. Barron took a deliberate step forward, his height forcing Calloway to look up at him. Then why didn't you ask about her work tonight? About the children she's helping? The crowd shifted. It was a straightforward question, but it cut deep. Calloway had no real answer, and he knew it. His job wasn't to highlight Melania's contributions. It was to turn her into a political target. Before Calloway could regain his footing, Barron pressed on. You came here for one reason, to make headlines. You didn't care about the purpose of this event. You wanted a viral clip, something to post on Twitter to rack up a few thousand likes from people who already agree with you. The room went silent. A few guests near the back exchanged glances, realizing that Barron wasn't just reacting, he was controlling this moment. Calloway's confidence wavered. He glanced at the other journalists in the room as if searching for support, but none of them spoke. They weren't used to being challenged like this, especially not by a Trump, and certainly not by a 17-year-old. Melania, who had remained quietly behind her son, rested a gentle hand on his arm. She didn't say anything, but her expression conveyed everything: pride, resilience, and an unspoken message. I'm right here with you. Realizing he was quickly losing ground, Calloway attempted to regain control. He forced a smirk and crossed his arms. You're young, Barron, he said, shaking his head. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't even blink. I know exactly how this works, he said smoothly. I've watched people like you go after my family since I was a kid. The journalist's smirk disappeared entirely. Barron stepped forward again, his voice unwavering. I just never imagined you'd be desperate enough to target a woman who's done nothing but try to help others. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Someone in the back even let out a quiet gasp. Even some journalists, expecting another routine takedown of a Trump, were momentarily stunned into silence. Calloway's face flushed slightly, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Barron's right. A man in a well-tailored suit stood near one of the round tables. He was older, with salt and pepper hair, and the confident demeanor of someone who commanded attention, a well-known businessman, perhaps even a donor. He locked eyes with Calloway. This is a charity event, he said. This isn't the place for petty political ambushes. More murmurs rippled through the room. A few heads nodded in agreement. For the first time that evening, David Calloway looked unsure of himself. His moment was slipping away, and Barron Trump, he was far from done. The silence in the ballroom was thick, charged with tension and anticipation. Every gaze was fixed on Barron. No one had ever seen a Trump challenge the media like this, not with anger or distraction, but with cold, deliberate precision. He wasn't lashing out, he was dismantling Calloway piece by piece. David Calloway, the once assured liberal journalist, clenched his jaw. He was losing control of the moment, and he knew it. He had arrived expecting to bait the young Trump into an awkward mistake, a headline-worthy blunder. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm he hadn't anticipated, Barron Trump standing his ground. But Calloway wasn't finished. He forced out a chuckle, shaking his head like Barron was nothing more than an inexperienced teenager. You know, Barron, he said, it's easy to defend your family when you've been raised in a tower of privilege, but out here in the real world, people like me have to ask the difficult questions. That's what journalism is. A few familiar faces in the crowd instinctively nodded, but something felt off. The usual rhythm of media attacks wasn't landing tonight. Calloway's words sounded strained, almost desperate. Barron tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth hinting at a smirk. He had him. Oh, you mean the real world where my mother is dedicating her time to charity while you're here trying to make a headline by humiliating her? Calloway's smirk disappeared. Barron stepped forward, his voice remained steady, but it commanded attention. You want to talk about the real world? Fine. He gestured toward the audience. How many people here came tonight to support children, to talk about education and giving back? A few hands went up, others nodded. Even those who weren't Trump supporters hadn't come for a political battle. They were here for the cause. Barron turned back to Calloway. "And how many of you showed up to watch him turn this into a spectacle about himself?" The crowd stirred. A few quiet laughs spread across the room. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Calloway was no longer steering the moment. He started to speak, but Barron cut in. "No, really," Barron said, pausing as if waiting for an answer. "Because from where I stand, the only person who thought this was about politics was you." Scattered applause broke out. It wasn't just polite, it was approving. Barron crossed his arms, locking eyes with Calloway like a predator assessing its prey. "You came here hoping to humiliate my mother," he said. "Instead, you humiliated yourself." The room erupted. Even those who weren't Trump supporters recognized what had just happened. Barron had done something no one had seen before. He had outmaneuvered the media at their own game. Calloway's face flushed with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but the moment had already slipped away. His self-assurance, his cockiness, it had all vanished. And then, to seal his victory, Barron leaned in slightly and delivered the final blow with effortless composure. "Next time," he said, "if you want to go after a Trump, maybe pick on someone your own size." The ballroom erupted in applause. Calloway went rigid. He had no retort. He had played his game, and tonight he had lost. As Barron turned back toward his mother, standing poised and unwavering, one thing was undeniable to everyone in the room. The youngest Trump had just left his mark. The applause was still echoing when Calloway grasped just how badly the tables had turned. His once confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a strained, artificial expression, as though he was struggling to maintain composure while everything collapsed around him. Barron stood tall, his posture strong, his gaze locked onto Calloway like a predator, eyeing wounded prey. He had seized the moment, and the audience recognized it. Calloway was no longer the hunter, he had become the hunted. But the journalist wasn't ready to concede just yet. He adjusted his tie and forced a chuckle. "So that's it?" he asked, attempting to sound unfazed, though the edge in his voice was gone. "You're saying I can't ask questions because it might make your family uncomfortable?" Barron's expression remained steady. His voice stayed calm, unwavering. "You didn't ask a question," he said. "You made an accusation." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. Even those who weren't Trump supporters couldn't deny that Barron was right. Calloway's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward a few other journalists, silently searching for support, but none of them spoke. They all understood what had just transpired. Calloway had lost control of the room. Barron stepped forward once more, not with aggression, but with purpose. His mere presence was enough to make Calloway instinctively retreat half a step. "You tried to paint my mother as the villain," Barron continued, "but you failed because the truth is, she's here contributing, making a real impact." He gestured toward the charity banners draped behind the stage, showcasing the faces of children and families aided by Melania's foundation. "And what about you?" Barron tilted his head slightly. "What are you actually bringing to this event besides negativity?" Calloway's face darkened to a deeper shade of red. His confidence had crumbled. His posture betrayed his unease. His shoulders stiffened. His grip on the microphone tightened. And for the first time, he appeared uncomfortable. The audience was no longer on his side. Some had even begun shaking their heads in disapproval. Calloway swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. Barron smirked faintly. "Then, maybe," he said, "you should try doing it better." The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't just polite applause, it was deafening. Even those who had arrived skeptical of the Trumps couldn't deny what had just unfolded. Calloway had entered, expecting to take control of the room, to twist the night into his own spectacle. Instead, he had become the spectacle. And Barron Trump, he had just dismantled him completely in front of the elite media establishment. Melania, who had been quietly observing, smiled softly. There was no need for words. Her son had already said everything that mattered. Calloway, recognizing there was no salvaging the situation, slowly lowered his microphone and turned away. The walk of shame had begun, and Barron Trump, he simply turned back to his mother, standing firmly by her side. Because tonight he wasn't just defending her, he was proving that the next generation of Trumps was here to stay. David Calloway clenched his microphone so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. He had lost completely. And the worst part? It wasn't because he had been shouted down. It wasn't because someone had cut him off. It was because a 17-year-old had completely outmatched him in front of everyone. The audience was still murmuring, some clapping, others whispering, while a few simply stared at Calloway as if witnessing a man unravel before their eyes. Even some of the reporters, his own colleagues, refused to meet his gaze, too uncomfortable to be associated with what had just unfolded. But Calloway wasn't ready to give up. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers. This was supposed to be an effortless victory, a perfectly orchestrated takedown that would spread like wildfire online. Instead, he stood there, looking like a fool, completely humiliated in front of the very people he had aimed to impress. He had to turn this around immediately. Plastering on a smirk, he raised the microphone one final time. "Well," he said, "if you can't handle a little challenge, maybe politics isn't for you." It was weak, a last-ditch effort to land a blow, but Barron didn't so much as blink. He didn't recoil, didn't waver. He simply smiled, a calm, almost amused smile that spoke volumes. "That's it? That's all you've got?" And that's when Calloway knew he was done. He had thrown everything he had, yet Barron remained completely unfazed. The applause that followed wasn't just for Barron anymore. It was for the undeniable fact that Calloway had just sealed his own fate. A quiet wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone chuckled. A wealthy donor in the front row leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her grin. Calloway noticed. He noticed everything. And in that moment, he understood. He wasn't just stepping away from this debate. He was walking away in disgrace. His jaw tightened. He mumbled something under his breath, barely audible above the noise, before finally turning and leaving the stage. The cameras captured every step he took. He had walked into this ballroom expecting to make headlines. Instead, he had become one. And now, the entire world was watching. Meanwhile, Barron turned to his mother. Melania met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a brief moment. Then, with the same poise and elegance that had defined her for years, she simply reached out and adjusted his suit jacket. It was a subtle gesture, yet it spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, offering her a small nod before turning back to face the room. Sensing the significance of the moment, the crowd rose to their feet. The applause was deafening for Melania, for Barron, but also for the undeniable fact that something had shifted tonight. For years, people had dismissed him, seeing him as nothing more than the youngest Trump, a figure in the background. But after tonight, no one would ever underestimate him again. David Calloway clenched his microphone so tightly his knuckles went white. He had lost completely. And the worst part? It wasn't because he had been silenced. It wasn't because someone had cut him off. It was because an 18-year-old had completely outclassed him in front of everyone. The crowd was still murmuring, some clapping, some whispering, others just staring at Calloway as though witnessing a man unravel in real time. Even some of the journalists, his own peers, avoided eye contact, too ashamed to be associated with what had just unfolded. But Calloway wasn't ready to give up. He could feel his entire career slipping through his fingers. This was supposed to be an effortless victory, a perfectly orchestrated ambush that would dominate headlines within minutes. Instead, he stood there like a fool, humiliated in front of the very audience he had hoped to impress. He had to recover quickly. Forcing a smirk, he raised the microphone one last time. "Well," he said, "if you can't handle a little pushback, maybe politics isn't for you." It was weak, a final, desperate strike. Yet Barron didn't even react. No flinch, no retreat, just a smile. a knowing, entertained smile that conveyed everything. "That's it? That's all you've got?" And that's when Calloway understood. It was over. He had thrown his best, yet Barron remained standing, untouched, poised, unfazed. The applause that followed was no longer just for Barron. It was for the undeniable truth. Calloway had sealed his own fate. A murmur swept through the crowd. Someone laughed. A wealthy benefactor near the front leaned over to his wife, whispering something that made her grin. Calloway caught it. He noticed every bit of it. And at that moment, he understood. He wasn't just leaving this discussion behind. He was walking away in disgrace. His jaw tensed. He mumbled something under his breath, barely distinguishable over the rising chatter, before finally turning on his heel and making his exit. A walk of shame. The cameras followed his every move. He had stepped into this ballroom expecting to dominate the headlines. Instead, he had become one, and the world would be watching. Meanwhile, Barron turned toward his mother. Melania observed him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with the grace and dignity she had always carried, she calmly reached forward, smoothing his suit jacket. A subtle gesture, yet one that spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, giving her a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to face the crowd. Sensing the significance of the moment, the audience rose to their feet. The standing ovation was thunderous, not just for Barron, but for the profound shift that had just taken place. For years, people had dismissed him, viewing him as merely the youngest Trump, a figure lingering in the background. But after tonight, no one would ever underestimate him again. What a moment it was. Barron Trump hadn't just defended his mother, he had proven he was a force to be reckoned with. The way he held his ground, the way he shifted the dynamics of the room, this was beyond a simple debate. It was a declaration. What's your take? Did Barron respond to the situation appropriately? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story engaging, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another impactful story. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.